the number one thing that people should know is that 50 cents on the dollar goes to somebody other than the manufacturer when it comes to prescription drug spending. 50 cents on the dollar goes to somebody else. At Pharma, sometimes it feels like the general public, policymakers, like to give manufacturers 110% of the blame for what we spend on medicines, when in fact it's about 50 cents that ultimately goes to the manufacturer that had to take on an incredible amount of risk to bring that medicine to a patient. Keep in mind, most drugs that enter a clinical trial fail. They do not lead to an innovation that makes its way to patients. So they're taking on a substantial amount of risk. And at the end of the day, there's a lot of intermediaries that sort of stand in the way of either patients getting access to or extracting value from that innovation.
Today's guest sits at the center of the conversation shaping drug development, patient access, and the future of medicine in the U.S. He's a leader at Pharma, and he represents the companies that drive pharmaceutical innovation around the world. Please welcome my guest today, Dr. Mike Ybarra, the Chief Medical Officer of Pharma, the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America organization. Mike, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure. I'm excited to talk to you today. So much going on in the last year or so in the world of healthcare, pharma, so a lot to talk about. Maybe just for the audience who isn't familiar, give us a little bit, of a background on yourself and kind of, your training and what got you to where you are today.
Certainly happy to do that. Thanks again for having me. I'm an emergency physician. I feel like I live the Pit, the TV show that's on right now, at least in my training. If you know a physician, you probably have heard the show is very true. It's very close to reality, and I find it a really good one to watch, and it's very moving. And so that's the background that I sort of take. I did medical school here in DC. I did residency in DC in emergency medicine, and after a few years of being sort of a frontline pit doc, as we say, a frontline emergency physician, I moved into industry because I was really interested in sort of helping to shape that intersection of health policy, innovation, and real-world patient care. I still work clinically. I see patients about once a month now in the emergency department here in one of the DC hospitals. And I find it a good way to stay connected to medicine, to have those real patient experiences, and it really informs the work that I do.
I love that. So you're still seeing patients, huh? That's great.
Yeah, I work clinically about once a month, a little bit more, a little bit less, depends on travel. But my full-time job is at Pharma, and Pharma is the trade association that represents the innovative biopharmaceutical companies. I'm really pleased to have been there for over a decade now. It's been 11 years. And my role's evolved over time, but as you said, my current role is as a senior vice president in our advocacy and strategic alliance department, and then also wear the hat as the chief medical officer for the organization. And I think that role in particular, I'm really focused on leading our work with across the departmental team and our members around vaccines and science advocacy. So it's a really interesting and exciting time, and certainly a lot of challenges.
Yes. So let's jump right into it. There's a lot, like I said, going on in the news about drug pricing and just yesterday around Medicare Advantage. So I want to ask you, from where you sit at Pharma, what do you think maybe is the biggest misconception that policymakers and the public too have about how drug pricing works? Like, walk us through that. And maybe if you want to maybe talk a little bit about the 340B drug pricing program too, for maybe the audience that isn't familiar with it.
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, I think the number one thing that people should know is that 50 cents on the dollar goes to somebody other than the manufacturer when it comes to prescription drug spending. 50 cents on the dollar goes to somebody else. At Pharma, sometimes it feels like the general public, policymakers, like to give manufacturers 110% of the blame for what we spend on medicines, when in fact it's about 50 cents that ultimately goes to the manufacturer that had to take on an incredible amount of risk to bring that medicine to a patient. Keep in mind, most drugs that enter a clinical trial fail. They do not lead to an innovation that makes its way to patients. So they're taking on a substantial amount of risk. And at the end of the day, there's a lot of intermediaries that sort of stand in the way of either patients getting access to or extracting value from that innovation. So that's, I think, the top line thing. 50 cents on the dollar goes to somebody else. The other thing that I think about a lot as an emergency physician is just how much we rely on generic medicines. The US ecosystem is really unique, and that over 9 out of 10 prescriptions that a doctor like me writes are for a generic medicine that's typically low cost. So we live in a world in the United States where we have innovative medicines that have a period of time where they need to recoup the value for the cost of R&D for not just that medicine, but all of the failures as well. And for a period of time, we reward innovation. And then after a certain period of time, generics enter the market, prices go down really, really substantially. And patients benefit from that. Most generics are really, really inexpensive, and there's a lot of ways that patients can access them. I've gotten really good at talking to patients about that. There's a lot of ways we can get into that. But you mentioned the 340B program, so that's a whole piece of that 50 cent that I'd love to dive in on.
Yeah, I'd love for you to explain that to the audience.
Sure. So I think 340B, you may not have heard of it. If you have, I think what I like to relate it to is, like, most people have heard about hospitals that charge maybe $50 or $100 for Tylenol. They've sort of seen that story written. But what many don't realize is that same dynamic of hospital markup can apply to something like a cancer medicine. Hospitals can buy medicines at deeply discounted prices through this program called 340B. Then they bill insurance companies and ultimately patients at a significantly marked up rate. Sometimes it could be hundreds or even thousands more than they paid through the 340B program. And really, this program enables that markup. Hospitals can buy at a very, very low price. There's no requirement that those savings be passed on to patients when they are receiving the treatment or when they're at the pharmacy counter. And hospitals keep that spread between the discounted purchase price and what insurers or patients are being charged. And again, patients may not benefit. I always sort of joke, I've never worked in a place where you can sort of press the 340B button and access a service or access sort of a lower price for patients. On the front lines, we're often left to sort of figure out, how we can help a patient afford in real time, how we can help them out. But that's not often because of 340B. So in our advocacy, we are very supportive of helping vulnerable patients. In fact, we really want the benefit to flow through to patients, making sure that there could be some sort of sliding fee scale for patients so that if you're uninsured or underinsured, that you would get a discount from that program. But our concern is that it's at this point really drifted far away from the original intent, and it's really just enabled these hospital markups.
Yeah, well, that's why I brought it up, because I think from its original intent, it's nowhere where it is now in terms of reaching the goal and helping patients get access to these therapies. And, I'm really glad you brought this up, because what a lot of people don't realize, as a former pharma guy, I always talk about this when I'm, whether on the news or other podcasts, is the fact that in the end of the day, the pharmaceutical company, they want the patients to get access to these medications. Matter of fact, at our organization, the ACMA, we're the ones that credential and certify all the field reimbursement professionals. People don't realize pharma companies have teams and teams of people that their job is to help the people that are working in the doctor's offices streamline access for patients, dealing with the insurance headaches. So they're there, they're trying to support, they're trying to help them. And I think you brought up a very good point. I mean, two important points. One, around the gamble. When you're trying to launch a drug and develop a drug, it's a gamble. It's a big gamble. It's a big risk that the pharmaceutical companies are taking. It takes about 10 to 14 years on average to bring the drug to market. And then if you bring it to market, then you might have to deal, like you talked about, some of the middlemen, some of the challenges in trying to get that drug reimbursed. And that's a big challenge for a lot of pharmaceutical companies. So I think really important points, and hopefully for the audience listening out there, it gives you a deeper understanding of really how drug pricing works. I think there's this myth out there that pharmaceutical companies are just getting 100% of that entire profit. But again, there's so many middlemen that are involved.
That's right. You raised a good point too on the time. The 10 to 14 years that it takes. That's really there's data out there that shows that it is almost on average 12 years. And I think sometimes people forget that because they might hear about a drug that comes to market much sooner. But on average, it's about 12 years, and it's between $2 and $3 billion to bring that drug to market. So really good points.
Let's talk a little bit about, what's happening now. We've heard, the Trump administration talk a lot about direct to patient access.
Hmm.
And a lot of companies, Lilly, Pfizer, a few others, are looking
Hmm.
at providing certain types of drugs directly to patients to kind of
Hmm.
bypass some of what's happening on the insurance side.
Yeah.
Do you see that maybe as like I guess, I don't know, a short-term pressure release valve, or do you see it as maybe a structural shift that's going to persist over the next decade or so in terms of how
Hmm.
pharma companies get medications to patients?
Hmm. Yeah, I'm really pro sort of disruption. I think I really am interested in some of these models. And I, again, sort of think back to some of those clinical encounters that I have with patients. And you mentioned the teams that companies have to sort of help patients gain access. And we really do benefit from that on the front lines. As an ER
Mhm.
doc, I can think of discharging a patient home and knowing that I can help them with copay assistance, for example, and I can confidently say, you're going to pay $10. We're going to discharge you on this medicine will help you with the condition that you have,
Right.
and here's the out-of-pocket cost. And that certainty is so critical for me as an ER doc, because I don't get to see the patient again. I'm not like their primary care doctor that might say come back in a week. It's sort of, I get to meet you for a period of time, and then I'm trusting the system to sort of work on the back end. And what manufacturers often do through those copay assistance programs and the teams that they have is really help ensure that patients don't fall through the cracks. And so I think what interests me a lot about some of these models that are emerging is just the kind of clarity that it can provide in some situations. Obviously, it's not one size fits all, but it's exciting that we can sit down with a patient and say this offering's out there too, and it might be more convenient, it might be less expensive, and here you can learn about it because it's kind of out in public. So I'm interested in it. I think it's exciting. I think it's patient centric in many ways too, particularly for certain disease areas where it makes sense. Again, it's not necessarily a one size fits all solution, but it is exciting in the scenarios that I think is being rolled out.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see, like I said, whether or not it'll persist long term as a
Mhm.
strategy. Because again, the insurance companies are really making it more and more difficult. We see it all the time on our end at the
Mhm.
ACMA. We see what's happening with some of these particular,
Right.
especially the specialty drugs that are in the biologics, et cetera. They're
Mhm.
making it hard to get access to those medications. Let's talk about most favored nation. Again,
Mhm.
this was something that came up last year, that was discussed in terms of why is it that in other countries therapies are
Mhm.
cheaper? What can you
Right.
maybe explain a little bit about that? A lot
Right.
of the public wants to understand why is it that the drugs here in the US are more expensive? And then
Right.
to that point, what is most favored nation?
Certainly. Well, first of all, I think, every healthcare system has its challenges, including ours, right? I work on the front lines. I see where patients fall through the cracks. But I think as it pertains to these cross-country comparisons, how the US compares to other countries, when you're diagnosed with a serious disease, say cancer, for example, the place that you generally want to be to receive the most comprehensive care and have access to the widest array of treatments is here in the US. And I see that, even in my clinical practice, where people with really serious diseases come to the
Mhm.
US and they get their care at comprehensive cancer centers, or they get their care at transplant centers here in the US. And what other patients might face in other countries is barriers that their governments might put up. So, the UK, for example, breast cancer patients have had to publicly campaign to get access to certain medicines that may not be covered by their system yet. Even though there's data that's presented that's promising and patients in the US may have access. And so this isn't because the science doesn't exist, it's because of the trade-offs that those countries make to achieve lower prices. And those trade-offs might include things like price controls. They might include things like value assessments that undervalue the lives of certain peoples with certain illnesses, just narrower formularies, and in some cases later launches where a company may not be able to launch because of those conversations with national health systems. So most favored nation, you're right. It's a topic that's been discussed a lot. I actually think it goes further than last year. It goes to, it was talked about, even before that. There's been bipartisan sort of interest in various flavors of it. But I think our concern is the idea that you can import the price without importing the system, and recognizing that those systems do have trade-offs. And I
Yeah.
think that's sometimes missed.
On that note, in terms of policy, one of the policies, as you know, that was brought about, I think it was through the Biden administration originally, was the IRA, Inflation Reduction
Hmm.
Act.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about it, because we know that some pharmaceutical companies had an issue with it. And I want you to explain why there was an issue
Hmm.
in it. I was one of the proponents that I also had an issue with it, because I felt like
Hmm.
it could potentially stifle innovation. Maybe talk to the audience a little bit about, what is IRA, and
Hmm.
why, could this potentially impact innovation when you're, capping the price of certain drugs?
Yeah, certainly. So the IRA is really under this umbrella of quote unquote Medicare negotiation. And so it's been talked about since Medicare Part D passed into law. Medicare Part D is the pharmacy benefit. So the drugs that you get, when your doctor prescribes them and sends them to the pharmacy. The way that Medicare Part D was originally set up was sort of a marketplace where Medicare Part D plans negotiated with manufacturers. So I always like to say Medicare negotiation did happen. It was happening between insurance companies and PBMs and manufacturers. It wasn't a centralized sort of system. And what the IRA did was it actually layered on top of those private sector negotiations, now sort of government mandated price controls for a certain set of products. And I think one of the really concerning parts of the whole framework was the distinction that it put on small molecule medicines like pills versus the large molecules like infused biologics. And the reason is because it gave a shorter time horizon for the small molecule pills than it did for the large molecule biologics. And that sort of puts the government's thumb on the scale for what it's going to pay more for. And we've already seen investment shift. We've sort of been tracking sort of investments and VC interest in small molecule versus large molecule. And we have seen a shift as a result of the Inflation Reduction Act. It's what's known as the pill penalty, that the IRA disincentivizes the development of those because of the time horizon. So, the pill penalty is in place, and we're concerned about the impact that it's having. Layer on top of that other proposals like other price controls, I think that could certainly make things worse.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree. And I think, this is something that, again, a lot of the audience doesn't recognize in terms of what these policies can mean long term on pharma. Um, let's talk about vaccine innovation and monitoring. Obviously, since COVID, there's been
Mhm.
a lot in the news about vaccines, a lot of, recent controversy about, vaccines in certain areas. What's pharma's, I guess, official stance on some of the recent vaccine controversies?
Well, sure. That's a huge topic. I mean, I think me
Mhm.
personally, I'm a huge proponent of, vaccines, talking to your doctor about which vaccines are appropriate for you, probably in part because as an emergency physician, a lot of what I see is infectious diseases and then certainly, trauma as well. Trauma is not on the topic for today, but as an ER doc, we got a lot of sort of combination of infectious diseases
Right.
and traumatic injuries. And so I'm very interested in it. And also as an ER doc, I'm interested in the fact that we've been able to leverage vaccines to basically like eradicate certain diseases from showing up. I mean, the most obvious to me is COVID, but I know that sort of evokes a lot of thoughts and emotions. So setting that aside, for the moment, like a disease like rotavirus. I mean, when I was training, before a rotavirus vaccine was recommended and widely given, like we used to see kids all the time being admitted to the hospital for dehydration from rotavirus. And I've seen some really tragic cases of serious side effects or serious impact from that dehydration, lifelong impact from certain kids. So images of sick children are really sort of like seared into my memory from my training. And then it's remarkable that over the course of what I think is like a relatively short medical career, my kids beg to differ. They think I'm super old, but
Ah,
I
sure.
still feel very young. It's just amazing that like we used to hospitalize all these kids with rotavirus, and now you don't see it at all anymore.
Mhm.
RSV, we've seen significant declines in the number of infants with needing to be hospitalized, or I have seen significant decrease in infants needing to be hospitalized for RSV bronchiolitis in the winter. And the data that I've sort of seen coming out of other countries that have really good tracking systems actually shows the same. So all that to say, vaccines can be a really powerful tool for keeping people healthy. I mean, prevention is the best investment we can make, and vaccines are a preventative tool. So our our overarching stance on vaccines is that they're a really important tool. At the end of the day, we want people to really have the ability to make the choice. And I think policy decisions that are coming down need to really reinforce that ability for people to make the choice and have access. So that's sort of
Sure.
our macro thinking on the topic.
All right, let's maybe kind of shift a little bit. I want to talk about pharma interactions with healthcare providers. And a lot of times, again, in the public, and even I would argue among some healthcare providers, there's this sense that the pharmaceutical companies, they just at will kind of they can go out and talk
Mm-hmm.
about things off label, proactively, that there's really no
Mm-hmm.
bounds. But that's not really true, right? Pharma has a pharma code in place in terms of guiding interactions with healthcare providers. Talk to the audience a little bit about that, what that is, the pharma code, and what pharma stance is on how pharmaceutical companies are guided in terms of their pharmaceutical reps, medical liaisons, and interacting with healthcare
Mm-hmm.
providers.
Yeah, certainly. Well, I think most important is just to reiterate what you said, which is that we do have a pharma code. It's on our website. Happy to share it if we're able to link it here. And it really just sort of provides the outlines of what appropriate interactions look like. They should be science-based communications. They should be consistent with the label. So I think we really try to address that issue head on. But I do think there's often a bit of a hangover from maybe something that happened when I was like a child, for example, 30, 40 years ago. But things are really different today. The world looks really different today in terms of the ways that people get information. And so I think we've really tried to be very sort of open and in terms of developing the code and then making sure that it reflects the ways that we interact just kind of as humans, through in-person interactions, but also all the ways that we're consuming, information and media these days.
Yeah, so I think that's a good point, because you guys on the pharma code side are really providing the guidance to the pharmaceutical companies again on how they should be interacting, whether it's the types of gifts that are allowed, not allowed, the types of interactions. What we do at the ACMA really is make sure at the individual level that
Mm-hmm.
pharmaceutical rep, that medical science liaison, that they're meeting some type of minimum competency standard. They actually have competencies in place through certification to go out and be able to have those discussions. Because what a lot of people don't realize is, especially on the medical affairs side, a lot of the medical science liaisons, they could spend up to 45 minutes on average with a healthcare provider. And the healthcare providers are relying significantly on a lot of that information that comes from those field-based folks that work in pharma companies. So I think, it's important for the audience to know that between what the pharma folks are doing with the pharma code, with the ACMA, and what they're doing in terms of competency standards, today is very different than what it was, to your point,
Mm-hmm.
back in the late 90s when I first started in the pharmaceutical industry. It was much more lenient. And I think, we've learned, some mistakes have been made, but now ultimately, we're in a very different world today. So I think that's an important point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think too there's sometimes I speak a lot to medical students, and I get that question at in medical school venues, and I think sometimes too there's this perception like, well, why should I have to engage with the pharmaceutical company? And I always say, the companies know their data. They can answer questions about how studies were designed, and I think from a medical perspective, what I encourage the medical students and residents that I work with is just get really good at reading data, so you know how to analyze studies and what questions to ask, because there is so much that's changing in terms of practice that it's hard to stay on top of everything. Of course, we all subscribe to and read various resources. I have my own sort of set of resources that I go to make sure I'm staying up to speed. But at the same time, engaging with the companies that may have designed the clinical trials to bring new products to market. I mean, I had some really important interactions with companies in the pandemic to sort of understand things like monoclonal antibodies and how we use those in the emergency department. And then, getting back to the vaccine topic, there's still a lot of misunderstanding about mRNA technology and what it is. And as physicians, we really needed to get up to speed to understand how that platform was developed, really understand the science behind it. So these interactions with companies, I think, can be very, very meaningful. And our job as medical professionals, if you're not in industry, is just to really know how to analyze data, to review studies, so you can ask those questions and engage sort of meaningfully in a dialogue.
Yeah, no, those skills are critical. We just started 2026. What would you say are maybe the 2 or 3 top priorities for pharma this year?
Yeah, well, you really hit on them, and in the topics that we've discussed. We're concerned about expansion of sort of pricing models like most favored nation pricing, or we're clearly sort of navigating the waters and the way that the IRA is being rolled out and the impact that's having on investments. You talked about other pressures on the pricing system. So, again, there's a lot of focus on these cross-country comparisons. And one thing that's very different about the US is that in other countries, 50 cents on the dollar don't go to PBMs, health insurance companies, and then 340B drug pricing programs. So when you don't sort of dig in on that, piece of it, then it's easy to just focus on the top line difference between healthcare systems. So pricing is a big area of focus, but it doesn't mean just things like MFN and IRA. It means making sure people understand the role that PBMs and insurers play, the role that 340B plays, and the pricing differences. And then, I spend a lot of time on the topic of vaccines, as you mentioned. Again, our goal is that people can continue to access what their doctor recommends, and doing it in a way that doesn't create friction. I had a family member who was eligible for a vaccine, but they were initially turned away at the pharmacy counter because of confusion. They ultimately went back and got it, but the first interaction was, I'm not sure if I can, give me some time. And this family member went back, a week later or whatever it was, and got the vaccine. But I think we all know that sometimes in healthcare, you really only get one chance sometimes. And so when we create friction, when we roll things out in ways that could be confusing to providers, it can lead people to miss things. And that's what I'm worried about. And that's sort of what we're working on, is how can we create and maintain a really system that doesn't put friction in the way of patients getting access to what doctors are recommending for people.
No, that's great, and I think that's really important for, again, the audience to understand in terms of the work that you guys are doing to streamline access for patients. I have one last question for you. Again, we're in 2026. Let's say you and I were to record this podcast again in 2030. What do you think would look different in the pharma ecosystem or the healthcare ecosystem? I'm curious.
Well, it's a great question. And one of the reasons I really like working in pharma too, I sort of joke with my ER colleagues, you could sort of plot me in the middle of the ER, 15 years ago, and it probably would feel almost the same, using the same EHR, still have a fax machine. The thing that really changes is the technology that we have, the tools that we have, and that really is the innovation coming from industry. So 4 years from now, if you look back 4 years from now, like 2022, that there is a lot different from a technology standpoint. So I'm hopeful that we'll have, mRNA cancer vaccines that can sort of work as we're seeing with immunotherapy. Like the data is very promising there. Immunotherapy cancer vaccines could be really exciting. mRNA cancer vaccines could be really exciting to be used along with immunotherapy. I'm really hopeful for continued innovation in the cancer space in particular. We've come a long way. American Cancer Society put out data last week that 7 out of 10 people survive to 5 years post-diagnosis. But there's more that we can do there. And those survival gains can be improved by continued innovation. And then I'm also excited about sort of the rare disease space. I know that's an area of focus for a lot of companies. There's just so much unmet medical need. And so I think more to come there. And we didn't even say GLP-1. Do I get to do a podcast without mentioning GLP-1? I mean, that's exciting.
It's a whole separate podcast. I want to hear what you think about the GLP-1 craze.
I mean, they're so exciting. I think 4 years from now, we're going to have a lot of data on some of these other indications that I think you're probably hearing about. But the studies that are underway to look at applications for GLP-1s, well outside of some of the original indications. And that gets back to the policy point, right? Like, why is the IRA timeline concerning to us? Because the IRA timeline is so short for price controlling these medicines. And yet there's so much that we could learn through continued research. And when you put an arbitrary timeline like the IRA, it might stymie some of that. So
Yeah.
4 years from now, I think we're going to have a lot more data on additional uses for GLP-1s, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what that has in store.
Yes, yes, yeah, that I'm very excited about. There's a lot going on there mechanistically in terms of, what you can do, whether it's secondary in terms of improving obesity or just, the GLP-1 agonist itself in terms of other diseases. So that'll be exciting. And the one last thing I'll say is I think about too the importance of helping to support innovation in pharma, just even from a dominance perspective for us in the U.S. I think that's really important.
100%,
So that's
100%.
again a whole other conversation, but I think it's critical. We don't want to stifle innovation in terms of what we're trying to do here in the U.S. Mike, it was a real pleasure having you on. I think you provided a lot of good insights, a lot of good information. Love to have you back on, as things develop. But it was great to have this discussion.
Excellent. Thanks for having me. Yeah, I would love to come back. And we also didn't touch on China. I think that's what you're meaning. So happy to do that
Yes,
next time.
yes, yes, I was. Yes. Thanks, Mike.